Hello everybody, and welcome back to lesson 14.4 in the Alice tutorial series. As we finished lesson 14.3, we had just created an Alice world using billboards and some PNG images, and set up a couple variables to get us ready for random number generation. So the real center piece of this episode here is going to be using the random number generator in Alice. Now, if you haven't looked at video 14.3 yet, and you're just here to learn how to use random numbers, it might be worth your time to go back and just quickly look at lesson 14.3 because the example world that we use is going to be based off of lesson 14.3, and you might be able to figure out random numbers by watching this video if you don't know how to do them, but it might be easier to follow along. So just kind of keep that in mind. We are going to be starting from a world that's already been created in a previous world. Now, random numbers are just a fantastic skill, and they add a lot of character to your program because users don't always know what to expect, particularly when we get into video games and interactive programs. So I'm going to go ahead and load up Alice and load up the world that we created in the last video. I'll meet you over there, and we'll get started with lesson 14.4, parameters and random number generation. And here we are back in our world. Just to give everyone a quick tour or reminder of where we were at, we've added 3 backgrounds, a space background, an ocean background, and a sky background, along with a space... I didn't even see that in the last video. The spaceship cockpit, the high-tech plane cockpit, and the helicopter cockpit. Let's go ahead and rename that now. Oops. I'm sure some of you saw that in the last video and were kind of laughing at me about that. So we have those 3 objects there. Make sure that your cockpits are all set, their vehicle property is all set to the camera, and they're all is showing false, and they're kind of positioned in front of the screen so that when they're turned on, they're directly up against the camera. And then make sure your backgrounds are all set up so that when they turn on, they fill the screen as an entire background. So that's what we did, and then we also had this method display screen where the sky and the cockpit were selected at runtime to display when the program is run. So right now we have the ocean background with the large spaceship cockpit, and if I hit play, you can see I get my ocean background with the spaceship cockpit. And if I change this and say I want the, let's call it the blue sky background, and I want the high-tech plane cockpit, hit play, and I can switch them around that way. So that was kind of the setup for the program. If you didn't get that done, take a look at lesson 14.3. And then the last thing we did in that video was in the world properties, we set up 2 number variables set to 1. A background seed and a cockpit seed, both set to 1. We're going to be using these in our display screen method to randomly generate a scene for our Alice world. Now, before we move forward, you have to understand how random numbers work in Alice. So let's kind of evaluate that right now. To start, I'm going to right-click on background seed and watch this variable. This way, when I hit play, I can see the value of background seed over here on the right-hand side. I want background seed to be a random number between 1 and 3. Background seed will eventually become a representation of one of these 3 backgrounds, and I want the background to be randomly generated. So the way we'll do this in Alice is let's take background seed and drag it out into my first method. I'm going to set the value initially to 1, but this 1 is just a placeholder that's going to represent a random number. Since I want a random number, in world, go to functions. This will not be available if you have another object selected. You won't have a random number option. Make sure you're in the world, click on function, and choose random number. Drag that over the 1, and you will now see you've got background seed set value to random number. When you hit play, see background seed is worth a value of 0.55. And every time I restart, I'm getting a new value. By default, random number with no additional arguments will generate a number between 0 and 1, and it will be a decimal number. That's not what I'm going for in this program, so I'm going to provide a couple arguments that will make the number what I want the number to be. I'm going to start by setting a minimum number of 1 and a maximum number. Now, most new programmers say a maximum of 3. Give me a random number between 1 and 3. However, a very important point to remember, not only in Alice but many different programming languages, this maximum is not inclusive. That means I can generate a random number between 1 and 3, not including 3. If I want 3 to be a selectable number, I need to add, in this case, 1 to it. So this means I can get a random number between 1 and 4, but 4 is not an option to be selected. If I test this out now, I hit play, and see I got 1.01, 2.63, 2.09, 3.89. I'm still getting these decimals, which I don't want. Luckily, there's another argument we can use. This argument is integer only. Integer only by default is set to false, meaning you'll get a decimal number. Since I don't want decimals, I'm going to set integer only to true. This will give me only whole numbers. I can get the number 1, 2, or 3, but not 4. Hitting play now, and see the background seed was 2, 1, 3, 2, 3. I'm getting only the numbers that I want to use. So I've got a good random number generator going here. The only thing that I'm going to do one last time is add a duration argument to this whole random number generator and set the duration to 0 seconds so that it creates a new number instantaneously. So when my program is run, the first thing that happens is background seed is set to a random number between 1, 2, and 3, and only 1, 2, and 3. Now that we have a random number generator, we're going to use this background seed to create a random background from our list. Now it should be noted that what we're going to do here is probably a little bit inefficient as far as programming goes. And we're going to purposely do this a little bit inefficient so that you can see more of the logic of how these functions work together. But there are easier ways and faster ways to do this. But if you don't understand how it works in this long form, it might be difficult to shortcut your way through. So as you watch this right here, just know this isn't the only way to accomplish this, and there are simpler ways to do it, but we're purposely kind of drawing this out a little bit so you can see how different methods interact with one another. Now what I need to do is create a new world method. So go to World Methods, click Create New, and we're going to create a method called setBackground. The purpose of this setBackground function will be to look at the random number that was generated and then choose the appropriate background accordingly. Just so I can keep this straight in my head, I'm even going to add a comment as the first line, and this will say, this method will use the random background seed to select an appropriate background. Now over in properties, you can see that I already have a background seed variable. I want to create a new object variable, so let's create a new variable, and this will be called background image. This will also be an object with the value initially set to none. So right now I have an object variable called background image that isn't equal to anything. Using an if statement, I'm going to by default select true. But this true is just a placeholder. I want to check the background seed variable. So drag that in there. And I've got a list of different selections. I've got equal to, not equal to, less than, greater than, less than or equal to, or greater than or equal to. Since I want to see if the background seed is equal to 1, I'm just going to check, is the background seed equal to 1? If it is, the background image is going to be set equal to the space background. So let's go back to our properties. If the background seed is 1, the background image will have its value set to space background. We're going to use a second if statement and see if, and of course we're using the placeholder value of true, but I want to know if the background seed is equal to 2, Then I want the image to be the ocean background. So let's select background image, set the value to ocean background. And you guessed it, we're going to do the same thing for number 3. So if the background seed is 3, so let's, if true, and say if background seed is equal to 3, then we're going to set the background image to blue sky. So background image, set value to blue sky. And for all of these, I'm going to set the duration to 0 seconds so that this happens instantaneously when the if check is made. So all of them have a duration of 0 seconds now. I now have a set background method that when called will check the background seed and set the appropriate background based on that number. To demonstrate how this works, right-click on background image and let's watch this variable. If you hit play, we're not calling set background now, so let's go ahead and add that. So go to my first method, and so the first thing we want to do here after we set the background seed is run the set background method. So go to methods, select set background, and we don't have any parameters for this. Hit play, and we can see that the first thing, we got a background seed of 3 and the background image of blue sky. If I restart, 1 got me a space background, 1 got me a space background again, 3 gets me blue sky, 2 gets me ocean. So what's happening is this background seed is being randomly generated, and then that random number is being checked by set background, and the background image is being set by that number. We're going to do the same thing for the cockpit. Let's create a random number for the cockpit seed. So go to properties and let's go to cockpit seed, set value to 1. This will be a placeholder. Go to function and choose random number, and cockpit seed will be a minimum of 1, a maximum of 4, only an integer. So let's go true, and over a duration of 0 seconds. This is the same thing that we did for background seed, except now we're generating a cockpit seed, and it just so happens that we have 3 cockpits to pick from as well. Now that we have a random cockpit seed, let's create a set cockpit method that we can use as well. So let's create a new method, and this is going to be called set cockpit. And it's going to be almost identical to what we did with set background, except we're going to be checking a different seed and assigning a different variable. So if you click on properties, we're going to have to create a cockpit image variable as well. So create a new image called cockpit image. It will be an object set to a value of none. Now we want to check the cockpit seed, so let's add our comment here and just say what we do for this. The method will use the random background seed to select an appropriate background. So this method will use the randomly generated cockpit seed to create an appropriate variable, or something to that effect. Now we want an if check because we want to see if a condition is true. Is the cockpit seed currently equal to a value of 1? If it is, then the cockpit image will be the large spaceship cockpit. So, cockpit image, set value to large spaceship cockpit. We're going to repeat that for each of the other checks as well. So if the seed is equal to 2, then we're going to have the high-tech plane cockpit. So that object is set equal to high-tech plane. And our final if check is if cockpit seed is equal to 3, then we should be getting the image of helicopter cockpit. So drag cockpit image, set it equal to helicopter cockpit. So now we have two different methods that are running. One sets an appropriate background and one sets the appropriate cockpit based on these random numbers being generated between 1, 2, and 3. Going back to my first method, I'm now going to run the set cockpit method as well. And let's make sure we're watching all of our variables. So let's watch cockpit seed and watch cockpit image. When we run this program, you can see we've got a random number generator that assigns an appropriate image based on that random number. So if I restart this now, we've gotten 1 and 1, 2 and 3, 3 and 3. So every time this program is run, it will randomly select a background image based on this seed and randomly select a cockpit image based on this seed. Now, the way our program is set up, we are getting a different background and cockpit seed every time we run this program, and the background image and cockpit image are being set by these two functions right here. All that's left to do is display the screen. So let's grab this display screen method and drag it here, and we're first being asked to provide the sky image. Well, we've already done that because we've set the background image. So even though it's off my screen here, select Expressions and then World.background image. If you do that, it will ask you now what cockpit image do we want to use. Again, select Expressions and World.cockpit image. So your screen should now look like this. I know that my selections were kind of off the screen a little bit, and I'm sorry about that. But it's saying when we display the screen, we want to display whatever the background image is, which is set by setBackground method. And whatever the cockpit image we want to display is whatever's been set by the setCockpit method. Hitting play now, I can see that I'm getting a randomly generated screen. This is a helicopter image over the ocean. You see this right here. Next time I get a space background with the spaceship cockpit. I get the blue sky with a high-tech plane cockpit. And every time I restart this program, I'm getting a different cockpit with a different background image. So I think that's a pretty unique program right there, and it's something that is pretty cool to be able to do in Alice. Now here in this programming window, all I get is this blue screen. It doesn't look like a whole lot, but I'm using world methods and variables to my advantage. I've got a method that sets the background based on a random number. I've got a setCockpit method that sets the cockpit image based on a random number. And when I first call this program, I'm randomizing these numbers each time, giving me a different image every time I run this program. So we're getting ready to kick off the Lesson 14.4 challenge program, but one more side note that I think is just really neat about the way this program is set up. You've created now an infinitely scalable program. setBackground and setCockpit are just checking a random number. If you were to add, let's say, a total of 10 backgrounds, all you would need to do is set the background seed to create a random number between 1 and 10, and then add the appropriate checks to this background method. If you do those two things, this program right here will choose from 10 different backgrounds, 20 different backgrounds, 30. It's limited only by the amount that you plan to put into setBackground or setCockpit and the number that's generated here in my first method. So it's really a scalable program that you can do some cool stuff with. With that in mind, let's go ahead and try out the Lesson 14.4 challenge program. Okay, so your Lesson 14.4 challenge program centers on what we just did there. I made a couple slight changes to it. The first thing I did was I downloaded some appropriate sound effects for each of the cockpits. So the helicopter sounds like a helicopter, the spaceship sounds like a spaceship, and the plane sounds like a plane. In addition, I added some real subtle moves to whatever cockpit gets selected so that it sort of looks like the vehicle is flying. So since it says audio, I'm going to quiet down and you can watch some of the different practice runs of this program. So you can kind of see how that program worked. You had the slight movements. It doesn't have to be real over the top, but having that movement will add some realism to your scene, and then having the appropriate sounds will also add some immersion for whoever's watching the animation. And some of the other things that you could do that aren't demonstrated here is maybe having randomly generated background music, or adding, instead of having 3 options for cockpits and 3 options for backgrounds, maybe having 10 of each. So definitely, play around with that and make something that you're proud of. As always, if you have any questions for me, just leave them in the comments. I'll help you get your programs working. Thank you so much for watching the Alice tutorial series, and have a great day.